Hey everyone, welcome to a new video, welcome to my channel. My name is Maaike and today we are going to be talking about Gothic fiction. It's nice and gloomy today, so I apologize for the lighting in this video, but it's positively almost like dark outside even though it's only 4 o'clock. So we're just winging it. I think it's the perfect setting to talk about Gothic fiction. In case you didn't know, I did a Gothic fiction video 3 years ago over on my other channel because I didn't have this one yet. So I'll make sure to link it in the eye above. And I just thought it was time for an update to talk again about one of my favorite literary genres, which is Gothic fiction. So I'm going to breeze through some of the books that I also showed you in that video so that you know what you can expect from that, but I'm going to do it very quickly. And then we'll sort of tag on why I wanted to do this video today. So the video that I did previously was sort of split into two, where I first talked about 5 classics, and then there were 5 books that were sort of like what I thought great places to start if you like this idea of Gothicness, but you don't really know where to start and you want it to be a bit more modern than some of these things. So in that video I also explained what Gothic fiction actually is, which is not what a lot of people think it is, which is horror. Gothic is not horror. Yeah, there is Gothic horror for sure, and the genre definitely got darker and darker as time progressed. But don't mistake Gothic fiction for just blatant horror slasher kind of stuff, because Gothicness really has to do with much more like an atmosphere. And one of the reasons why I think a lot of people think that Gothic has to do with horror is because a lot of these more classic Gothic stories were very early on adapted by Hollywood into movies that we now view as some of the first horror movies. So because of the genre or the medium being changed for the narrative that was being told, the emphasis of these stories is very different from how they were originally intended. So I have another one in my updated list in a minute. But that, for instance, happened to one of the biggest Gothic fiction classics of all time, which is Dracula. Dracula and vampires in general, a lot of these are about vampires, have been reiterated and recreated over time so many times, but they sort of all miss the point of the true Gothic nature that Dracula has, and I try to explain it in my previous video, because vampire stories weren't anything new when, Stoker made his novel. In fact, I showed you this book called Dracula's Guest in that video as well, and this is a short story collection with lots of stories about vampires, and a lot of them predate Dracula by a century and a half. So vampires have been around for ages, and actually a lot of mythologies and folklore from around the globe have vampiric sort of characteristics to them. So vampires aren't anything new. But what Stoker did is to take these tropes and ideas that a lot of people were very familiar with, but like this book will show you, a lot of the times vampires were set and these medieval kind of ruins, sort of castles away somewhere in Italy. It was never close by. And what Dracula did very cleverly is take this legend of vampires, link it to an historical character that really truly existed at some point in time, and that just had a very bad reputation. But then he took that character and also placed it in contemporary London. So that's why this book was so incredibly brilliant, and why it embodies the idea of Gothicness to a T, because if you start reading this as a modern reader, it's not necessarily scary at all. It's written through letters, so you're very much sort of away from the action a lot. So it's quite a slow burn actually, but it does touch upon all these different things, things like the human psyche and this atmosphere of eeriness. That's much closer to Gothic fiction than your slasher horror that we're used to right now. So do make sure you realize that. So I think I've mentioned these. And then the last sort of vampire story that I featured in that video is I Am Legend by Richard Matheson. I think that's how you pronounce his name, or Matheson, I'm not sure. I've always heard it pronounced as Matheson, but apparently it can also be pronounced as Matheson. We'll see. Anyways, this is, if you've seen the movie with Will Smith, it doesn't mention vampires at all, but this book is definitely a vampire novel. It's one of the best vampire novels of the 20th century, which is why I put it in that video. And then the other two picks that I showed you for classics in that previous video is Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, because it really ties into this Gothic idea of like the human psyche, which in the Victorian era was very important, and Edgar Allan Poe, because even though not all of Poe's stories are Gothic per se, he does feature quite like eerie atmospheres in a lot of his works, which is why I decided to feature that too. And then I featured some other things. I thought that a great place to start if you're new to anything Gothic is to read something like Dracula's Guest, if you really like vampires, or something like this, like an anthology, which is short stories. And there's quite a few like short stories about like from Gothic fiction. So this is particularly American Gothic tales because they're sort of like a split. And this is just a bunch of short stories by all of these different authors. So if you want to get into the genre, this can be a great place to start. And then I featured some modern things that I read that I thought had Gothic elements to them, but that weren't Gothic per se. So I featured Wise Blood by Flannery O'Connor. If you like weird books with unreliable narrators, that's another thing that Gothic fiction is famous for, unreliable narrators. Then make sure you check this out. Or of course, any of these. American Psycho by Bret Easton Ellis. I could not read this right before bed because it made me feel so uncomfortable. It's gross. It's gross. It's not scary, but it's gross at times. And then these two books are quite similar too, because we have Martin Amis Money, where the main character does all these bad things, but he is sort of like caught in the end. And then we have Kill Your Friends by John Niven, which sort of follows a very similar plot line, but there the character doesn't really get away, does get away with everything rather than being punished for it. So those would be the 10 books that I already featured in my previous video. And now I just want to breeze through 10 picks that I have for you that I wanted to mention as sort of like an update, things that were recommended to me because of that video, or that I thought I could discuss because people brought them up in that video as well, and just other things that I was like, oh yeah, I could have mentioned that too. Honorable mention, but I don't own it yet, is Anne Radcliffe's The Mysteries of Udolpho, which is supposed to be like a very early like Gothic story. I've never read it, but it's been on my like to get list for a long time, so I finally bought it. Got a book haul coming soon. And I also wanted to mention the OG classic when it comes to Gothic fiction, which is Walpole's The Castle of Otranto. This is like very often mentioned as like the first Gothic story. It's not very big. I just remember this being about a giant suit of armor that attacks people, if I'm not mistaken, but it's been a very long time since I had to read this in college, so I could be very wrong. And then for the updated stack of books, I wanted to mention books that I've read and books that I haven't read yet, but that I'm planning to, or that I'm actually going to be starting very soon. So let's start with the books that I have read. And I think a book that some people mentioned in the comments was this one, Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. And I've never really thought of this as a Gothic novel. And the reason why I don't think it's that Gothic is because when I read this for my classes, the focus was very much on the characters, Heathcliff and Catherine and all those people and how they interacted. And Heathcliff is then very often promoted as a Byronic hero. And the Gothicness of it is much more like the moors and like the atmosphere, the landscape around it almost. So it perhaps has a Gothic element to it, but for me, when I read this, it wasn't really at the forefront. For me, this is just a romance with like a horrible relationship in it because Heathcliff is not a nice person. But this is definitely a book where I'm like, is it Gothic? Is it not? It's sort of like towing the line. And the reason why I'm saying that is because I later on read this book, because this has been a while since I read it, but I read this last year, and this is Daphne du Maurier's Jamaica Inn. And this book is very often mentioned in one breath with Wuthering Heights, for it very much having this inspiration from this is set in Cornwall, whereas this is set somewhere in the north of England, so the setting is different, but that Daphne Maurier sort of took inspiration from Wuthering Heights for this atmosphere with this like landscape and everything else that's going on around it. However, I feel that Jamaica Inn is far more Gothic because the mystery is just a little bit bigger, the eerie atmosphere that's there, with this uncle that kind of really looms over this girl all the time, and he's not a very kosher person at all. I think that makes this story much more Gothic than this. So if you like something like Wuthering Heights, but you want it to be more Gothic, then maybe go with Daphne du Maurier's Jamaica Inn, because this is great. If you don't know what this book is about, I can't remember the girl's name anymore, but her parents die and she needs to move in with her uncle and aunt, and they run the Jamaica Inn, and this girl then has to work there as a barmaid, and she stays with them. But her uncle, it turns out very quickly, she already notices like what he's up to in his spare time, he's up to no good. And so there's a couple of like mysteries and things that she needs to resolve, and then at the same time there's this like swampy kind of nature going on around her that also like she loses her way, and so that just adds to the atmosphere and the mystery, so this is a really good one. Then I also wanted to mention this, Annihilation, and actually the reason why I thought of this is because Richard Matheson's I Am Legend is also more of like a sci-fi. It has a dystopian element to it, as does this. And the reason why I thought that this had a Gothic sort of leaning element to it is because in this book, I haven't read any of the other ones because I thought this first one was enough. It very much reminded me a little bit of this like Lovecraftian like creature mystery kind of thing. So this just starts with a very sort of scientific basis of these people going on an exhibition to this area that whenever they send anybody there, some people die instantly, some people never come back. So there's already been 12 different expeditions to this area. And then one by one, of course, everybody starts to go missing and all that. So I felt that this, when it came to like weirdness and eeriness and all that, even though it's more of like a sci-fi and it has this strong science element to it, I thought that this could fall into this like Gothic-y sort of element too. I thought it was a cleverly written story. And then two books that are like classics, I think, in the genre, and this one I wanted to mention because Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House was turned into a Netflix series, and that was like so popular that they've now come up with Blind Manor. Those are things I don't watch. I love Gothic fiction, but I don't watch horror stuff because I can't sleep. Yeah, so, but one book by Shirley Jackson that I read is We Have Always Lived in the Castle, and this is, again, in terms of Gothicness, it's one of those things where, depending on how you read the book, you get a different experience. And if you sort of know or realize what might be going on with some of the characters in this book, you start to realize like, oh, okay. And then it becomes extra eerie. So in a sense, this isn't necessarily like a super scary book or anything, but it does definitely, again, have that eerie sort of atmosphere, sort of like, should people be here kind of thing. So I thought that that story was a great one from that perspective. I was able to brighten the camera a little bit, so I hope this is okay. And then we have Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. And I'm mentioning this because I very often see people on BookTube mentioning Frankenstein as a Gothic story. It's not a Gothic story. It can be. Again, depending on how you read this, it can be. However, I feel that this, even more so than Dracula, suffers from what I would like to call the Hollywood effect, where the monster has been emphasized in so many movies and like popular culture that a lot of people think of Frankenstein and already think they know what this book is about. Like Dracula, this book is not what you're going to expect if all you know is like the 21st century emphasis on the tropes that this is going on, and if all you know about this story is that it was written as part of like this ghost writing competition, as Mary Shelley was together with her, well, not quite yet husband, but her fiance at the time, Lord Byron, and Lord Byron's doctor. The four of them were in this hut in Switzerland and decided to write ghost stories on a rainy night. That's how this was conceived. But it doesn't mean that's a theme running through the whole thing. She probably started with the idea of the monster, but it's definitely not about the monster at all. In fact, out of all the characters in Frankenstein, the monster is quite possibly the most human. Which I've always found very strange. It definitely has a couple of like gothic-y elements, again, with like the nature and like those kind of things coming up. But it's almost as if like the only person with like an ethical, truly, like this is almost more like a study of what it is, what it means to be human. And Gothic fiction does do that at times, but this is not like a truly like classic, like to me, this is nothing like something like Dracula in terms of the themes that it discusses. It's much more almost like science fiction, like ethical dilemmas, philosophical, rather than really a focus on, ooh, look at this dark, mysterious thing going on. It's nothing like it. So this book, if you want to read it, I mean, it's not a very big one. It's a short one. I've read this like 2 or 3 times. It's good, but again, it's a slow burn. And if you are expecting lots of scary monsters in it, it's not going to happen. And then for some books that I either haven't read or read very, very recently, or I'm about to read. So I wanted to mention The 7 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle by Stuart Turton. Is this a truly essential Gothic story? I don't think so, but it definitely has Gothic elements, and those Gothic elements don't really come to light unless you read the entire story. So I can't really talk about it because I would be giving you spoilers, and I wouldn't want that. But this is a book that starts with this man who needs to solve the death of Evelyn Hardcastle, and he's put in different bodies every single day to try and solve it, so he gets a different perspective. So from that point of view, it's already very interesting. It takes place in this like Downton Abbey kind of like setting. It's super duper cool. It feels very much like a detective mystery at first, until you start unraveling why he is put in all of these different bodies and what's going on there. And then it takes a much darker, much more philosophical turn for sure. So that's why this book is a really good one. Is it really like truly Gothic? Again, it's a bit of a slow burn. I really felt the middle part of this took, because we need to get all of those perspectives in. It was got a little tiresome after a while. But in terms of like a modern Gothic fiction kind of book, I think this ticks a lot of boxes for me. And then a book I'm currently reading is Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. I definitely want to try and finish this before the end of the month. I have yet to start it. It's now a movie on Netflix as well. And I want to read this because I read Jamaica Inn, and that instantly made it to like my top 10 all-time favorite books. So I definitely want to read Rebecca and just see if I love it as much. And then 3 books that I haven't read, but that were recommended to me or that I found going like, I might like that. So The Monk by Matthew Lewis was definitely recommended to me by quite a few people who saw my first video. We're getting super dark here. I'm going to try and round off as quickly as I can. But yeah, this was recommended by a lot of people. I've heard it's a very readable book. I know nothing about it. I bought it, never read it yet. And then these 2 books, they are by the same author. They are by Michelle Paver, and it's Wakenhurst and Dark Matter. And Dark Matter is called A Ghost Story, and I think A Tale of Terror and Beauty and Wonder from the Financial Times. So that sounded quite gothic-y to me. And then she also wrote Wakenhurst, which I'm not even sure what that is about. Something to do with a manor. I don't know. Sounds mysterious, sounds dark, sounds gloomy. I think I want to pick up one of these in like November to try and read, to sort of keep the gloomy train going, you know, for the fall winter season. I think that's what I'm planning on doing. So there you have it, and before I lose all the light in today, I'm just going to round off the video here. I hope that you enjoyed this little updated Gothic fiction video from me. Please give it a thumbs up if you liked it. Subscribe to my channel if you'd like to see more by me. And then I would like to ask you to stay tuned, because I will be coming to you with my October wrap-up next week. And yes, I did read more books than I did before. So yay for me.